Welcome back, Sebastian. Here's time for my power rankings for the 2025 British Grand Prix. One of the best Grand Prix of the year, in my opinion. Wet race, quite chaotic. A lot of different things happened, so quite a bit to talk about for my power rankings today. Quite a few drivers who I think were pretty rightly in the kind of loser category, bottom half of this list. And again, the degree, the magnitude to which they had bad weekends, I think is pretty debatable. So I think for sure there's definitely some drivers you can move around here. But for me, for number 20, I'm going to unfortunately go with Yuki Tsunoda. So qualified 11th, which to be honest is a little bit better than what he's done recently. I would say bad qualifying, not an outright awful qualifying session. Still qualified by his teammate Max Verstappen by half a second. And then in the race, not so good strategy. Even though he didn't go on the absolutely disastrous strategy that drivers like Leclerc, Russell did at the start. He was on generally a pretty optimal strategy. He just had a really poor race. The online website, the journalist website, not the race itself. They described his pace during the Grand Prix as glacial, which is definitely not a compliment. It really was a reference to the fact of how slow Tsunoda was just compared to the rest of the field. And that was the kind of performances we were seeing from Lawson in the first two Grand Prix, where I'd say the race qualifying pace is still better for Tsunoda compared to Lawson, but race pace really poor. Had a bit of a scruffy moment with Behrman there, spinning him around, receiving a 10-second penalty for that, which of course contributed to him finishing last and a lap down, but still really poor Grand Prix overall, I would say, for Tsunoda, and I think very justifiably really close towards the bottom of the list. Now, number 19 is a driver who didn't even get started in the Grand Prix, so unfortunately very hard to judge this driver as a whole, but from what we got during the Grand Prix weekend, which was just qualifying, not great from Franco Colapinto. So qualifies dead last 20th, out-qualified by his teammate Pierre Gasly by 7.3 tenths of a second, a gap that was extenuated by the fact that Colapinto crashed out towards the end of the session and unable to complete a lap at the end, whereas his teammate Gasly, of course, was able to. Unable to start the race because of some kind of gearbox problem, which again, unfortunate, but still, from what we saw from Colapinto during the weekend, not a great race. And I do think there will continue to be more pressure on him to perform, especially over one lap, and to kind of try to cut these crashes out. And I know this is only second time, but really second time in 6 races is really still too much. Now, number 18 is Gabriel Bortoleto. Bortoleto, first driver on this list who out-qualified their teammate. Qualified 16th, out-qualified his teammate Nico Hülkenberg, who basically had the race of his career by 1.3 tenths of a second. For whatever reason, Sauber just not really having a pace over one lap. So again, qualifying was fine from Bortoleto, but in the race, a really silly error. Basically spun out on slick tires on a drying track very early on. And given what happened to his teammate, again, I think you'll really see this race as a missed opportunity. Also in the fact that he was one of the drivers that opted to go pit on to the wet slick tires right away during the formation lap, again, suggests that again, a little bit of a strategy error there on his part. I say on his part because radio communications are actually very limited in terms of what the drivers are allowed to do. From when the formation lap starts, in terms of radio communication, they're very limited in what the teams can give between the formation lap and lights out. So for all those drivers who opted to come to the pit lane and pit, generally that was I would say probably the majority of that was on the driver's decision, deciding let's take the risk, let's take the gamble, and that was one that really didn't pay off. So I do think the driver has to take a bit more blame for that than they usually would in such situations. Now, number 17 is Charles Leclerc. Pretty disastrous weekend for the second straight year at the British Grand Prix. Started the Grand Prix in 6th, out-qualified by his British teammate Lewis Hamilton by 0.03 of a second. So again, second best Ferrari driver over one lap. And then in the race, again, diabolical strategy call at the start. Not fantastic pace road. Even compared to George Russell in the Mercedes, he just wasn't able to recover as well. after that initial mishap as the British driver in the Mercedes, but still had a pretty scruffy weekend when, flying off Meggett's and Beckett's, doing a bit of rally cross there. And all in all, a pretty poor weekend for Leclerc. So again, 17th on my list. And probably you could justify probably putting him maybe a position or two lower. Now, number 16 is Liam Lawson, another driver who had a bit of a short Grand Prix, just like Franco Colapinto. But for Lawson, qualified 15th, out-qualified by his teammate Hadjar by 2.6 tenths of a second. And then in the race, unfortunately, first lap collision, turn 4, turn 5, with Esteban Ocon sends him into the wall. Now, I don't think Lawson was primarily responsible, in the fact that the stewards opted to not give a penalty for that incident. It suggests that the stewards agree with that. But that being said, I do think perhaps, Lawson could have given a little bit more room on the outside, gone a little bit more towards the outside of that corner, not cut so tight to the inside. Again, he doesn't know that there's 3 cars there, but it is the opening lap of the Grand Prix. You know that there's always a risk that those kind of things can happen. I think you want to be a little bit more cautious, perhaps, than Lawson was, especially in a race like this, where there was such an opportunity for big points to be scored by those who normally don't. So a bit of an unfortunate weekend for Lawson. Again, not 1 lap pace, also not great. But again, hopefully he'll bounce back stronger at the next Grand Prix. Number 15, I'm going to put his teammate Isaac Hadjar. For Hadjar, not a tough weekend, I think. I feel like the Racing Bulls had a little bit more pace in terms of 1 lap speed, and I felt like neither driver, especially based on their body language, their interviews after qualifying, I felt like really there was a little bit more pace there in the car over 1 lap, and it felt like neither driver really extracted it on Saturday. Qualified 12th, again, still better than his teammate, but in the Grand Prix, not a great start, pretty poor start, was one of the lowest classified finishers, and his race ended pretty prematurely as he rammed into the back of Antonelli and then crashed out of the Grand Prix. The crash itself, again, very low visibility situation, so I don't want to put too much blame on Hadjar for that, but again, it was one of those things where second wet race in F1 and second time he's crashed out. So again, there's starting to be a little bit of a trend there. Perhaps, Hadjar could have been a little bit more risk adverse in that situation, maybe gone a little bit slower. Again, it's really hard to say that given how poor the visibility was, but that being said, still not a great weekend all in all for Hadjar, so I think 15th is an appropriate spot on my power rankings. Number 14, a driver who showed massive glimpses of speed, and that really prevented this driver from being a lot further down on this list. Initially qualified 8th, which would have been, I believe, his best qualifying in F1. Out-qualified his teammate Esteban Ocon by 4 tenths of a second, so really good there. He's been, quite a bit better than Ocon over 1 lap in the last 3 or 4 Grand Prix, which as a rookie is really good to see, especially as we're at these tracks, these European tracks, which are, a lot of them are considered to be driver tracks, where, driver performance makes a bigger difference than at some tracks like, for example, Bahrain or Miami. So again, really good to see that 1 lap performance from Behrman. But of course, the reason why he started in 18th and not in 8th was because of the very silly crash I had in FP3 under red flag conditions. So again, pretty rightful that he got that penalty. And then again in the race, a bit unfortunate with the spin, getting spun by Tsunoda, but then right towards the end of the Grand Prix, takes out his teammate Ocon, which again breaks the kind of cardinal rule in motorsport, don't take your teammate out. Despite that, still finished 11th, 1 spot outside the points, despite being hit once. Really poor strategy at the start, and then of course spinning his teammate and then going for a synchronized spin himself. So still finished ahead of Leclerc, for example. I think really showed really strong pace throughout the weekend, which again is a positive. He just really needs to start putting together a clean weekend, and without those kind of silly incidents, easily could have ended up top 10 on this list, but because of that, drags him down to number 14 for me. Now number 13 is his teammate Esteban Ocon. So for Ocon, only finishes 1 spot above his teammate because, again, pretty anonymous weekend. Just, not a whole lot of pace there for the French driver. Qualified 14th, poor 10th gap in qualifying, like I mentioned. In the race, pretty quiet, never really looked like he was challenging for the points. Had actually really benefited from the strategy. I remember from my review yesterday when I showed the kind of positions on lap 14, Ocon was actually up in the points with just not a ton of great pace. and then ends up finishing 13th. Of course, getting spun by his teammate didn't help with that. But still, not a great weekend, I would say, for the British driver, or not the British driver, the French driver at the British Grand Prix, a track that historically he's never been, that fantastic at. All right, number 12 is George Russell. So for Russell, really tricky Grand Prix qualifying, really, really strong. Qualifies in fourth. I thought did a really good job maximizing the performance of the Mercedes car. Out qualifies his teammate Antonelli by 3.4 tenths of a second, which is exactly what he needs to be doing. And then in the Grand Prix, two real big tactical mistakes. Of course, the first one was pitting after the formation lap, going really aggressive on strategy. And again, this is not the first time that George Russell has decided to go really aggressive on strategy in a wet Grand Prix, saying, oh, I'm in 6th place, oh, I'm in 7th place, let's go for a really bold strategy. And he ends up finishing like 13th or 14th. This time he did recover to 10th, but again, easily should have finished 5th in this Grand Prix. He should have finished where Verstappen did. In fact, Alonso had already pitted on the dry tires at the very end of the Grand Prix. Anyone with telemetry should have been able to see, the pace isn't quite there. It's still a lap or two away. He opted to pit, then goes out on his out lap, spins through Meggett's and Beckett's. Very similar to what Leclerc did, although I think, Russell's was a bit more dramatic. But that being said, I think the big difference between Russell and Leclerc is that Russell at least looked like he was getting the motion of the car. Leclerc wasn't. And the other big one is that, Russell at least showed that he was able to have good pace and recover through the Grand Prix, which Leclerc was unfortunately not able to do. So despite the fact that, Russell, two big strategic errors on his part, and again, you can tell from the team radio that it really felt like these calls were coming from his side, not from the team. Again, that is going to lower his ranking in my eyes. So number 11 is actually his teammate, which again, you would say, why should he finish ahead of his, behind his teammate, despite the fact that, he was the faster driver. And again, those two big strategic mistakes, he basically threw away 9 points, which again, ironically enough, is exactly what Russell said of Verstappen in the Spanish Grand Prix. So for teammate Antonelli, qualifying again was okay, qualified 7th, of course, had that 3-place grid penalty for the contact with Verstappen last time out in Austria. In the race, again, was okay, not amazing, but not terrible either. Then unfortunately kind of a victim of Hadjar's torpedoing incident, basically lost the entire diffuser of his car and was forced to retire shortly thereafter. So not really a whole lot to comment for Antonelli. I think Grand Prix was, again, solid, didn't crash out like a lot of his teammates, just kind of in the wrong place at the wrong time, getting hit by Hadjar. So now into the top 10 we go, and number 10 is going to be Carlos Sainz. So far, Sainz qualifying went pretty well, out-qualified his teammate Alex Albon by 1.4 tenths of a second. For much of the Grand Prix, to be honest, looked like he was going to be in the points, just seemed to not have a whole lot of pace in the very final stint on the dry tires, and that dropped him down the field to 12th on the road. So a bit of an unfortunate one for Sainz. Again, the Williams didn't seem to have a very good weekend this time out. I think part of that is going to be the really windy conditions. We know this is a car that's very wind sensitive, but we also know that, again, this is a team that stopped development very, very earlier than pretty much every other team. And I do think that they're starting to fall down the pecking order just a little bit. They were basically clearly fastest. And some tracks like Miami, they were faster than Ferrari. They were the 4th best team. But again, I do feel like they've started to fall down the order a little bit, whereas now they're like 6th, 7th best, 8th best sometimes at some tracks. So a bit unfortunate for Sainz, but again, I thought he had an okay weekend, and especially when you had so many drivers who had, a lot of big issues this weekend, at least for Sainz, he still ends up in the top 10. So number 9, I'm going to go with his teammate actually, and that is Alex Albon. So for Albon, qualified 13th, out-qualified by his teammate, like I mentioned before. And then for much of the Grand Prix was kind of like on the edge of the points. Never really looked like he was going to challenge for the high points paying positions like some of the other midfield drivers were. But really good pace at the end of the race, and ends up 8th on the road. So really good performance there by him. Again, one lap pace was a little bit of a deficit there, so that holds him back from being a little bit higher on this list. But still, overall, I thought solid Grand Prix for Albon. Now, number 8 is Lance Stroll. So for Stroll, qualified 17th, qualifying continues to be a problem for this driver, and that really holds him back from being, on the top row of this list. For Stroll, opening stint of the Grand Prix, the strategy was basically bang on perfect. Started on the intermediate tires, was basically the only driver to switch to soft tires and actually had this strategy work. And then basically moved his way through the field back at the back markers, kind of the back of the first group on those intermediate tires while he was on the softs, and then again pitted at the exact right time for intermediates. And that put him up into a podium position, third place. So excellent job there to basically have a really strong pace, get those overtakes done. And again, good strategy on the side of the strategy team. Unfortunately, when the track started to dry out, basically towards the last 20 laps, didn't have a ton of pace. Dropped down the order from third all the way to seventh, overtaken on the final lap by Gasly. And again, with the position that he was in, a podium was on the cards. If he had stayed ahead of Hulkenberg, could easily ended up on the podium. But again, not particularly strong pace towards the end of the Grand Prix, so that kind of holds him back a little bit. And he ends up in 8th. Now, number 7 is his teammate, and you kind of, if you look at the screen, it's kind of funny. You have 5 teams all in a row: Aston, Williams, Mercedes, Haas, and then Racing Bulls, which is quite unusual. Usually never ends up like this, but yeah, very strange Grand Prix. So again, a bit of a strange board this weekend. But for Alonso, qualified 7th, I thought started 7th, I should say, qualified 8th, I should say. Yeah, qualified 8th, qualified 9th, because Behrman qualified 8th. Ill-qualified his teammate Stroll by 4/10, like I mentioned before. Honestly thought, Alonso had a really good Grand Prix, just had really poor strategy. Just didn't get pitted at the right time. And again, there's a bit of a tinfoil hat conspiracy theory, angled to that in the sense that, Lawrence Stroll is, again, going to be trying to prioritize Lance Stroll in terms of strategy, giving him preferential strategy and when he can, and given that Stroll had pretty much a perfect strategy, Alonso not a great strategy, he still ends up in the points. I do think, for example, does speak volumes to how good of a race Alonso did. So despite the poor strategy, still finishes in the points, finishes in 9th. So I think overall solid Grand Prix by Fernando Alonso. Now up into the top 6 we go. At number 6, we are going to go with Max Verstappen. Now, the pole lap on Saturday, really, really special, absolutely fantastic. And even if he hadn't won the Grand Prix, even with just that pole lap, there was a chance he could have still ended up number 1 on this list. Now, of course, he doesn't end up number 1. He ends up 6 in my eyes. And again, finishes 5th in the Grand Prix, which I think is realistically 2 positions lower than he could have with a perfect weekend. Of course, really unusual spin behind the safety car after that incident with Piastri. We haven't really heard any official word of what exactly caused it, so again, at this point in time, most likely driver error. Again, quite costly in that situation, given it dropped him from, I believe, 2nd on the road down to 10th. Whereas, that situation on a green track, like if the field was more spread out, maybe it only cost him, 1 or 2 positions, or maybe not even a position at all. So again, a bit unfortunate there that he loses so many positions. So again, that does drag him down. But like I said, qualifying, brings him up, gave him, a lot of leeway in this Grand Prix. And I think with the setup choices that were made with that Red Bull car, with a very skinny rear wing, it was always going to be very, very difficult to do very well in this Grand Prix. And even Verstappen himself said that he thought 5th was the best he could have done in this Grand Prix. I don't think, imagine that 5th place entailed being behind a Sauber. But, that's the situation he ended up in. So again, I'd say one of Verstappen's weaker wet races, but I think given the car, looking at what happened with Tsunoda and the horrific pace that he had, I think, Verstappen should still be, with that wing, with the qualifying. I think he still, performed relatively well this weekend. So I think 6 is still a good spot for him despite that mistake. Now, number 5 is your runner-up from this Grand Prix, Oscar Piastri. Qualified 2nd. Again, I do think underperformed a little bit in qualifying, out-qualified his teammate by 1.5 hundredths of a second. Looked like he was going to win this Grand Prix for large portions of it until the incident behind the safety car. Now, I think he basically did the exact same thing first safety car restart. I do wonder if the stewards had caught note of that and thought, okay, well, if he does, we're not going to penalize him this time. But, if he does this again, maybe we'll have to penalize him just because of, how bad the visibility, how bad the conditions were. He gets that 10-second penalty, I do think a little bit harsh. I think 5 would have been more justified. But still, I think, it's a learning experience for Piastri. reminds me a bit of Vettel's drive-through penalty in Hungary 2010, where he basically was more than 10 lengths behind the safety car and was given a drive-through penalty, which ended up costing him the win. One of those things where, again, it'll be interesting to see how he reacts in the coming races. And if that makes him stronger, or, makes him more determined, or is this kind of a setback that might have a bit of a snowball effect? We shall see. But that being said, overall, I thought Piastri really good Grand Prix, just unfortunately underperformed a little bit in qualifying, and again, that small mistake that had really big consequences for his race. Now, number 4, I'm going to have Lewis Hamilton. So for Hamilton, to be honest, pretty quiet Grand Prix. Qualifies in 5th, out-qualifies his teammate Leclerc, which is, again, really good performance there. And unlike, I think, 2 or 3 races ago in Spain, where it felt like out-qualifying Leclerc was down to the fact that Leclerc was, doing something different, trying to preserve tires for the race. This time, it really felt like he, generally out-qualified his teammate Leclerc on pace. Could have been on pole position, could have challenged for the front row, made a couple of mistakes towards the end of that qualifying lap. So again, not perfect, but still, better than his teammates. And then in the Grand Prix, to be honest, had a really solid race. And again, Ferrari, we know, struggle with these kinds of mixed condition races where you have to have, be right on top of it with strategy. And we saw what happened with the sister car down in 14th. But for Hamilton, I think overall pretty solid Grand Prix. I think maybe you could question why he was not able to be faster than Sauber, the Hulkenberg Sauber in the closing stages on a dry track, given that the Ferrari should be a much faster car in dry conditions. But that being said, that driver obviously hasn't showed up on my board yet, and for good reason. So I think still pretty solid Grand Prix for Hamilton, but I think 4th place is a good place for him. Now, number 3 is your race leader, or you're not race leader, your race winner, Lando Norris. Now, for much the same reasons I just mentioned with Oscar Piastri, I do feel like there was a little bit of underperformance here from Lando Norris' side, which again does prevent him from being in the top 2 on my list. So a bit unusual for the race winner to be 3rd, but I do think justified in this situation. So for Norris, qualified 3rd, again, probably should have been on pole position. And in the race, I thought, looked okay. Piastri looked like clearly the stronger driver of the two in the race. And again, if you remove the time loss from that penalty, Piastri, ends up quite a few seconds ahead of him up the road. And you have a very, very different picture, a very, very different outcome from this Grand Prix. And instead of, some great Lando Norris home victory, you instead would have been talking about Norris potentially or underachieving at home. So that being said, still overall pretty solid weekend. Gets away with a victory, and again, almost didn't put a foot wrong in the wet conditions. I don't remember seeing a single mistake on the part of Norris. So again, really good job from him there. But I did feel like there were 2 drivers who I felt had better weekends than him. So number 2 is Pierre Gasly. So for Gasly, qualifies in started the race in 8th, qualified 9th in the Alpine, which this weekend looked like it was a car that is going to be knocked out in Q1. So absolutely great performance by Gasly getting that car up into Q3. And then in the Grand Prix, just really, really solid Grand Prix. We didn't see a lot of Gasly. We did see him get overtaken by by Hamilton and Verstappen at points. But given how slow that car is on a track that's as power sensitive as this, even if it was a wet race, I thought, 6th place was an excellent result for Gasly. And so I think 2nd place on my power rankings is really well deserved. Now, of course, number 1, I think not a particularly big surprise this weekend is none other than your maiden podium sitter, Nico Hulkenberg. So first, before I talk about Hulkenberg's race, I want to go over some of the stats that were broken, some of the records that were broken from this race. So of course, previously, Hulkenberg infamously had the record for most Grand Prix without a podium. That record now goes back to Adrian Sutil, of course. But now, of course, Hulkenberg now has the record for most Grand Prix before a podium with 239, which is more than double the previous record, of course, held by Carlos Sainz of, I think it was 101 Grand Prix. So more than doubles that previous record. I can't imagine that record's going to be broken in a very, very long time. The other one, of course, Sauber's first podium in 13 years. Last podium for them was 2012 Japanese Grand Prix with Kamui Kobayashi. Finally, the last kind of big stat I wanted to mention was that it's the oldest a driver's been for their first podium in F1 since the 1973 Spanish Grand Prix. So that was over 50 years ago. So yeah, absolutely historic weekend by Hulkenberg. Quite a few big stats to come out of that. And yeah, for Hulkenberg, again, the one mark against him is qualifying. Qualifies 19th, out qualified by his rookie teammate Bordelot. I want to track that. Hulkenberg has historically been very good at, but of course, that pace did show up in the race. So again, if you want to look at that and say, Hulkenberg shouldn't be number one, got out qualified by his teammate, fair enough. But in the race, I think, strategy was absolutely bang on perfect, despite the fact that he started 19th. Ends up in 4th after kind of the first round of pit stops after the rain comes out. Really, really strong pace in those drying conditions, faster than Stroll, overtakes Stroll on track. Then perfectly timed that final pit stop for the dry tires. And even on the dry tires was basically, keeping pace with Hamilton behind him, not allowing Hamilton to close in too much. And then, of course, came away with that maiden podiums. Absolutely amazing pace by Hulkenberg. Really, really strong pace in the Grand Prix. Wet tires, dry tires, regardless of what it was, didn't put a foot wrong, didn't see a single mistake. So excellent Grand Prix by Hulkenberg, and I think number one is, justified for my power rankings. So there you go. Thank you so much for watching. That is my power rankings for the 2025 British Grand Prix. We now have a 3-week break until the Belgian Grand Prix, so I have some time for some more interesting analysis videos of that nature. So look forward to that in the coming days. So thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.